In the summer of 1944, as the dust of World War II thickened across Europe, something strange and unexpected was happening thousands of miles away. In the heart of Texas, the United States had built over 500 prisoner of war camps to hold captured Axis soldiers. Among them were several thousand German women, nurses, and auxiliaries who had served near the front lines. They expected cruelty, humiliation, maybe even death. After all, back home, they had been told that Americans were monsters. But when the trucks carrying them rolled into the Texas plains, what awaited them wasn't barbed wire and blood. It was sunlight, open fields, and a group of smiling cowboys. The women looked out from behind the truck's wooden slats shocked. They had seen men with guns before, but not like this. These men wore cowboy hats, carried lassos instead of rifles, and laughed like they didn't know what war meant. When the gates opened, one of the Texan guards simply tipped his hat and said, "Welcome to Texas, ladies." No shouting, no chains, no punishment. The Germans couldn't believe it. They were given food, real food, not the dry bread or cold soup they'd been surviving on for weeks. One woman later wrote in her diary, "We were enemies, but they treated us like guests." And then came the moment none of them could have imagined. The Texans brought out horses, big, muscular ranch horses. The women stared, confused. They thought it was some kind of joke. One guard smiled and said, "You're in Texas now. We don't walk when we can ride." The German women had never seen such kindness from the enemy. Instead of locking them in cells, the Americans gave them work in the fields, and sometimes even taught them to ride horses. They learned how to saddle up, how to control a horse, and how to trust again. In those wide open fields, surrounded by people they were told to hate, they discovered something they hadn't felt since the war began: freedom. Many of them cried that day not because of fear, but because of confusion. They had grown up believing Americans were evil. But these cowboys, with their boots and dusty smiles, were showing them the opposite. As the Texas sun dipped below the horizon, one young German nurse whispered to another, "Maybe we were wrong about them. The war had taken everything from them, their homes, their families, their peace." But on that strange day in Texas, something inside them began to heal. It wasn't victory. It wasn't defeat. It was humanity, the kind that survives even in the ashes of war. The camp in Texas wasn't what the German women expected. There were fences, yes, but they were more for keeping cattle out than keeping prisoners in. The guards weren't brutal soldiers. They were ranchers, farmers, and young men who just wanted the war to end. Every morning, the women would wake up to the sound of roosters and country music playing faintly from a nearby radio. They were fed eggs, bread, and sometimes fruit, meals better than what many civilians were eating back home in Germany. At first, the women were cautious. They refused to talk, stayed in groups, and avoided looking the Americans in the eye. But the Texans had a different kind of power: kindness. When one German nurse accidentally dropped a tray of plates, she froze in fear, expecting to be punished. Instead, the guard chuckled and said, "Ma'am, don't worry, happens to all of us." Then he helped her pick up the pieces. That moment broke something inside her, the invisible wall of fear that had stood between them and their captors. Soon, the women began to work in the nearby fields. They picked cotton, harvested crops, and sometimes sang old German songs. The Texans didn't stop them, they even clapped along. One evening, as the sun turned the sky gold, a cowboy brought out a harmonica. He played a soft tune, something slow, gentle, full of longing. The German women sat quietly, listening. Then, one of them began to hum. Another joined in. Before long, the entire camp was filled with a strange, beautiful sound: American harmonica and German voices blending into one melody. It wasn't war anymore. It was humanity rediscovering itself. The guards treated them with respect, but they never forgot who these women were: prisoners of war. Still, they gave them the dignity every human deserved. When a new group of prisoners arrived from Europe, tired, angry, broken, the women who had already been there told them, "You don't have to be afraid here. Texans are not like what they told us." Over time, some of the women began to laugh again. They wrote letters home, describing the strange kindness of the Americans. One woman wrote, They put us on horses instead of chains. I can't explain it, but I feel freer in this camp than I ever did in Germany. The war was still raging thousands of miles away, but inside that Texas camp, a small miracle was taking place. Enemies were becoming friends. Fear was turning into trust. The cowboy guards didn't see them as enemies. They saw them as people caught in a war they never asked for. And every evening, as the stars covered the Texas sky, those same German women who once wore the uniform of the Reich would sit by the fence, whispering about their dreams of peace, of home, and of the day they could finally say, "We survived and we were treated like humans." Weeks turned into months, and the German women began to adapt to their new lives in Texas. What had started as fear slowly turned into something deeper, understanding. They saw that these Americans weren't like the soldiers they had imagined. They didn't hate. They didn't humiliate. Instead, they offered something that war had taken away from everyone: respect. The women were given simple jobs, washing clothes, cooking meals, or helping on nearby ranches. The Texans trusted them enough to let them work without constant supervision. One day, a young cowboy named Samuel brought his horse close to the camp gate. The German women, curious, gathered around. Samuel smiled and asked, "Any of you ever ridden before?" They shook their heads. Some laughed nervously. Samuel reached out his hand and said to one, "Come on, ma'am. You'll love it." She hesitated, but finally climbed up. The horse shifted beneath her, and for a moment, her heart raced not from fear, but excitement. As Samuel led the horse around, she began to smile. The other women clapped and laughed. The sound echoed across the Texas plains. From that day on, every afternoon became a small celebration. The women learned to ride, to breathe in the open air, to forget the weight of war even for a few minutes. They started writing songs about their experiences, in broken English and soft German words. One of them wrote in her journal, "When I ride, I forget I am a prisoner. I feel like a bird again." The Texans noticed something remarkable. The women were changing. Their faces, once hardened by fear, began to soften. They laughed more. They even helped the guards with chores voluntarily. There were still rules. Escape was forbidden. Contact with men was limited. But the air of cruelty that defined most prisoner camps never reached here. One evening, an old ranch owner named Mr. Carter visited the camp. He watched as a German woman gently brushed a horse and said quietly, "War makes enemies, but kindness makes neighbors." Those words stayed with the guards and the women alike. Far across the ocean, bombs were falling and millions were dying. But here in the middle of Texas, something strange and beautiful was happening. Two sides of a brutal war were beginning to see each other as humans again. And every night, when the women sat by their bunks, they whispered stories of the day, about the horses, the laughter, the taste of freedom they were never supposed to have. Some even began to pray not for Germany's victory, but for the war to end, for peace, and for a world where kindness could exist without borders. That small camp in Texas had become a living example of something powerful, that compassion is stronger than propaganda, and sometimes, even enemies can teach the world how to forgive. By late 1945, the war was ending. Germany had fallen, the world was broken, and millions were lost. But inside that quiet Texas camp, something still felt alive. A fragile bond between former enemies. When the news of Germany's surrender reached the women, the camp fell silent. Some cried, others just stared at the dusty ground. They didn't know if their families were alive, if their homes still stood, or if they even had a country to return to. The American guards didn't celebrate that day. They didn't mock or boast. Instead, they gathered the women together, handed them fresh bread, and said softly, "The war is over. You'll be going home soon." The German women nodded, but their faces weren't filled with joy. Going home meant leaving behind the strange kindness they'd found here. For months, they had worked side by side with the Texans. They had learned to trust, to laugh, to forgive. Now, as trucks arrived to take them away, many of them wept openly. One woman, Maria, ran back to the stables one last time. She found Samuel the cowboy who had first taught her to ride. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered, "I was told Americans had no hearts. but you gave me mine back." Samuel took off his hat and said softly, "War takes everything, ma'am, but don't let it take your kindness." They didn't shake hands, they hugged. It was the kind of hug that spoke louder than any words. When the truck started moving, some of the women threw small handkerchiefs out the window, embroidered with German words for thank you. The Texans picked them up, folded them carefully, and kept them as reminders. Years later, historians would look back and call it one of the most humane prisoner of war programs in history. But for those who lived it, it wasn't history. It was hope. Some of the women who returned to Germany never forgot the Texans. They wrote letters, sent photos, and even named their children after the Cowboys who had shown them mercy. And those Texans, tough, rugged, and loyal, never forgot either. When asked why they treated prisoners so kindly, one old rancher said, "Because being human ain't something war can take away." The story of those German women POWs is rarely told, but it deserves to be remembered, because it reminds us that compassion can exist even when the world is falling apart. In the end, they were not just prisoners or guards. They were people who met in a storm of hate and found something purer, understanding. So when the last truck disappeared over the Texas horizon, leaving nothing but dust behind, the Cowboys stood quietly. No victory speeches, no pride, just a deep, wordless truth. Sometimes, the greatest strength in war is not power, but mercy. Years passed after the war, and the world slowly tried to rebuild. For many of the German women who had once lived behind those Texas fences, life was never the same. They returned to a country in ruins, cities turned to dust, families lost, hope scattered. But inside their hearts, they carried something powerful, a memory of kindness from the unlikeliest place on earth. One of the former prisoners, now an old woman living in Hamburg, once told her grandson, "When they captured us, I thought it was the end of my life. But in Texas, I found my soul again." She showed him a faded photograph herself on horseback, smiling beside a young cowboy. The picture was taken in 1945, just days before her release. Her grandson couldn't believe it, a German POW, smiling in America? But it was real. Back in Texas, that same cowboy, Samuel, had never forgotten her either. He kept the small embroidered handkerchief she'd left behind, with the German word "Dank" stitched in blue thread. He never learned to speak German, but he understood what it meant. For decades, stories like theirs remained hidden, quiet memories tucked away in letters, photographs, and diaries. But historians eventually uncovered them, revealing a side of war that textbooks rarely mention, a side where humanity triumphed over hate. The Texas camps were unlike any other in the world. They became a living experiment in empathy, proving that even in the darkest chapters of history, light can still find a way in. The women who once feared their captors began to admire them. They learned English songs, exchanged recipes, and even sent Christmas cards to their former guards after the war. Some of the Texans, too, felt changed forever. They had looked into the eyes of their so-called enemies and seen not monsters, but mothers, daughters, and sisters, people who had simply been caught on the other side of a cruel game. One old cowboy, interviewed years later, said something that summed up the entire story. "You can chain a body, but you can't chain the heart." Those ladies taught us that. Today, most of those women and cowboys are gone, but their story remains, whispered across the plains, remembered in old photos, told in classrooms where history still tries to make sense of war. They remind us that compassion doesn't need permission. It doesn't wait for peace treaties. It just happens quietly, bravely in the hearts of those who refuse to hate. And somewhere in Texas, under that wide, endless sky, there still stands the remains of one of those old camps. The fences are gone, the horses long since wild, but if you listen close enough to the wind, you might just hear it. The laughter of a few brave women who once rode free where they were supposed to be in chains.